Hello, welcome to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. Next week, starting the 15th of November 2020, is International Fraud Awareness Week. So we are talking about how you, your company, your team, your organization may be much better able to fight fraud than you may have realized. From the heart of London's financial district, I'm Kyle Hannon, and this is the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. It's brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, the unified voice of AICPA, and CIMA. This week, we're talking about insights from inside the finance and accounting profession that help you unlock the fraud-fighting tools you didn't know you had. And we're doing that because of next week, 15th of November 2020, is International Fraud Awareness Week. And we're talking about someone who has been looking at that well in advance of the occasion. She is the Associate Manager for Ethics Awareness here at the Chartered Institute of Management Accounting, that is CIMA. She's Bryony Clear Hill. Bryony, thanks for joining us. Where are you calling in from?
Thanks, Kyle. I'm joining you from Battersea in London, so just across the centre of London from the city. And I'm calling from just next to London's main heliport. So if there's some strange noises in the background, that'll be that. Okay,
so we'll be interested to hear which well-heeled helicopter clients are being shuttled in and out of the city, because at the moment they prefer not to use the buses or the tube. So that makes perfect sense. The tube, by the way, for our international listeners, is how we refer to the London Underground. So that's one more thing that you'll be learning on this podcast. But of course, that is not the only thing that we're focusing on. Bryony, you are the Associate Manager for Ethics Awareness here at the Chartered Institute of Management Accounting. What exactly are you working on? How does it connect with the accounting and finance profession?
I manage ethics here at CIMA, which means that my role is making sure that our members and students understand their obligations under CIMA's Code of Ethics. And really, it's about bringing the code to life through case studies, ethical dilemmas, articles, blogs, whatever medium necessary, really, to bring that Code of Ethics to life for finance professionals. I also spend time looking at ethics in the broader sense. So what do we mean by an ethical business, and what's the role of finance professionals in building that? So I've been looking recently at the Sustainable Development Goals and non-financial reporting and how those link into the role of management accountants.
Oh, so how do you actually do that? How do you put all of this together? Is it based on talking to people? Is it research? Is it philosophy instead of data?
It's a combination of all the above, really. So I spend a lot of time writing. And obviously thinking beforehand. So I do research like this report. I spend time speaking to finance professionals of all levels, speaking to students, and understanding really what their role is and where they're facing ethical challenges in their jobs. And then I write that up into articles and blogs, and I spend time working with our creative teams and just trying to communicate that in the most effective ways possible. I also do some work with potential CIMA students. So I give guest lectures at UK universities to finance and accounting students so that they're coming into the profession with their eyes open about the importance of ethics and what their obligations are.
I get it. And that's the kind of work that brings you here onto the podcast. Right now, this is particularly pertinent. And this episode, which is called Unlocking the Fraud Fighting Tools You Didn't Know You Have, it's sparked by some work that you've been doing recently, isn't it?
Absolutely. So a few months ago, I was writing a piece on financial crime during COVID-19, speaking to fraud professionals working in a variety of organisations around the world. And as part of that, I realised that, yes, in some organisations, you've got fraud specialists, you've got teams working on financial crime. But in other organisations, it really will come down to the finance professionals to manage fraud risk. So this report is essentially an introduction to what do we mean by financial crime? How do you risk assess your business? How do you put a governance plan in place? And then finally, what is the role of management accountants, and what does a good fraud fighting individual look like? What are those skills that you need? It's a personal interest of mine, having previously worked in an in-house role in ethics and compliance within a FTSE 100 company where we had a specific counter-fraud team, but I was also involved in those financial crime risk assessments. So it's an area where I have a particular interest, but I think the role of finance professionals is sometimes missed, especially in those smaller organisations where there might not be a specialist financial crime team.
Tell me a little about the report, because with the unavoidable consequences of this global pandemic and its impact on the way we do business and the viability of many businesses, but also in the way that we think about what we do afterwards, in the way that we run and administer our organizations, things have changed, not so much in the way we work, but in the risks that we as organizations or as practitioners actually face. So why did you put this report together now? And give me a sense of what the research explored and what the main findings have been.
So we conducted a poll recently on CIMA's social media, which suggested that 83% of people think that they've seen an increase in fraud during the COVID-19 crisis. And that number is similar to other statistics that have been found on different studies. So there really has been an increase in fraud during the lockdowns that have occurred this year. So that's why this report is so topical right now. Organisations were forced to very quickly completely change their ways of working. Some of them may have had existing remote working and have been better prepared, but others didn't have time to set up the right controls. So they very quickly changed from possibly verifying documents in person to having to do it online, or instead of speaking to the CEO to verify a transaction, they're doing it via email, which means that there are opportunities for more fraud. You've also got the fact that budgets are being cut due to the economic crisis and the difficulties that organisations are facing worldwide. And compliance budgets are quite often cut without thinking about the fact that actually, in the end, you might end up losing more because of a fraud that happened because those controls weren't in place. So we've got this kind of multiple different factors leading to additional fraud that's occurring really due to the economic crisis and the pandemic, forcing changed ways of working.
You mentioned that you'd come from a large organizational background. This research and the report that the research has led to looked at a variety of different size firms, did it? Or did it really end up concentrating on a particular category? For example, is it more the small to medium-sized firms rather than the larger ones that this research particularly applies to?
I hope that the report is interesting for any finance professionals, whatever organisation they're working in. But I suppose it is more aimed at the smaller organisations, because a large organisation is very likely to have a large team of counter-fraud experts, have additional resources and sort of artificial intelligence solutions and technological solutions that are constantly searching for and finding fraud. Whereas in a smaller organisation, it might end up being an individual who doesn't have a background in counter-fraud who becomes responsible for that. So that was really the target audience of this report, was giving those individuals guidance in how they can unlock their skills and really put in place a strong counter-fraud and counter-financial crime plan within their organisation. So it covers how to initially start off with a risk assessment, and then how to move through and actually put a governance plan in place and a fraud response plan if something does happen.
That gives us a good sense of who we're talking about. So let me ask you a couple of questions about the typical small firm. What are the vulnerabilities that, at the moment, the typical small firm may be doing best to deal with right now? And what might some of them be overlooking?
So I think the most obvious one during COVID that I'm sure a lot of people have seen themselves is an increase in phishing attempts. So especially mimicking government communications. I myself have received several texts claiming to offer me tax breaks from the government. And I know that organisations have received emails claiming to be from government organisations offering additional loans or tax breaks. So that's a really massive one at the moment. There's also a risk of additional spoofing emails. So this is where an email comes through. It appears to be from a senior member of staff, and it might ask for a PO to be approved very quickly or a payment to be made. So this is something that small firms really need to be looking out for, as this is something that criminals seem to be using more of at the moment. There are other types of fraud, of course. So we quite often in fraud talk about the fraud triangle. So there are three things that are quite often in place when a fraud occurs. There's some sort of a pressure, there's an opportunity, and then afterwards there's a rationalisation. All three of these are heightened at the moment. So there's additional pressures, there's budget cuts, there's financial pressures at home. There's also additional opportunity. So we talked before about the fact that compliance budgets are being cut, that ways of working have changed. So there's opportunities for additional fraud and there's controls that have been untested. So there's definitely a risk of increased internal or employee fraud. And I think this is something that small organisations shouldn't overlook. Hopefully nobody goes into work thinking today I'm going to do something really unethical. But when those three things are in place, and when there's an opportunity and there's additional pressure, it can lead to people making decisions that they wouldn't normally make, or people's ethical standards being affected by the difficult times that we're living in.
That sounds scary, because this may, on the one hand, be easier to perhaps exploit, but on the other hand, much less easy to detect. So what could be the typical cost of a fraud?
It's really difficult to say, because fraud can range from anything from a few pounds up to really huge amounts. But there are some interesting statistics out there. So a report last year from Crowe and the University of Portsmouth suggested that fraud costs the global economy £3.89 trillion every year, and that it's increased 56% over the last decade. And that same report suggests that the average organisation should expect losses of around 3 to 6% per year to fraud, which is an absolutely enormous amount, and something that especially small organisations really can't afford to be losing. So it's not really a case of thinking about how much an individual fraud might cost, as much as it is thinking about the total amount that might be lost to fraud, and equally seeing that amount as a saving that could be made if you're able to put things in place to prevent those losses in the first place.
I just have to caveat this with the admission that obviously I'm not an accountant, but to me, even my non-financial brain can see that just picking up, detecting and preventing this kind of fraud means that at the end of your financial year, you could be doing 10% better on the bottom line by stopping that type of fraud from hitting your organisation. Is that right?
It's really hard to quantify it, because a lot of fraud will be occurring that you don't know about. So you've got the fraud that you prevent. You've got the fraud that happens but you catch, and then you've got this massive bucket of fraud that's happening that you don't know about. So putting a specific percentage on it is incredibly difficult. But I think you can say that every organisation will be affected by fraud at some point, and any fraud that you can prevent is going to save you money on that bottom line. And especially at the moment when budgets are so tight and organisations are going through a really difficult time, this is money that you cannot afford to lose. So putting these things in place is going to lead to a saving in the long term.
I'm going to jump back to something you mentioned earlier, because you've talked about fraud, you've talked about financial crime. To me, I might have thought they were pretty much the same thing, but that's not entirely right, is it?
These two terms, fraud and financial crime, are often used interchangeably, but really fraud is just one element of financial crime. There are other areas, so we talk about bribery and corruption, and another massive area is money laundering, which is where criminals route money through multiple bank accounts, often internationally across borders, to hide links to illegal activity. We've also got things like terrorist financing, and you need to be aware of sanctions and other international things that are in place to prevent these financial crimes. So financial crime can take lots of forms, and it's often linked to really harmful practices like modern slavery and human trafficking. I think this is one of the areas where businesses really need to take note, and hopefully this report can help in identifying the fact that actually financial crime is much broader than just fraud.
And I'm interested to find out whether your report explored another aspect of something that you mentioned just a minute or two ago, that fraud has two components: the fraud that's been spotted and caught in time, something you've identified and are now actively working to try and head off. But there's also that second aspect, isn't there? The fraud that you didn't catch in time, the threat that you didn't identify. So did your report explore anything on that front about how those two compare?
Absolutely. So as I said, only a fraction of fraud is detected and prevented beforehand. During the report, we talk about how to risk assess your business, which can help you decide where to allocate resources to best save money for being lost to fraud. It also covers setting up a fraud response plan, which is how to respond when a fraud has occurred. And this is something we'll cover a bit later on. There's also the third type of fraud, which I mentioned, which is fraud that's occurring, which no one's detected. And this really is the biggest risk. And this is why it's important to make sure that you've got a robust fraud detection plan in place, you've got a risk assessment in place, and that you've activated all of your fraud fighting resources across the business.
You did say that this often isn't something that the bigger, better resourced organizations need to be worrying as much about. Does this affect every firm the same way, despite what resources they do have available?
Every organisation will have some form of fraud and financial crime happening somewhere within the organisations. And if they don't, to be honest, they're probably in denial about it. But there are certainly organisations that are at higher risk based on their size, their industry, their geography, and other factors. So big organisations with a really complex supply chain might be at greater risk, but they also are likely to have more resources available to fight it. So size it's not as clear as saying that bigger organisations are most at risk, because if they've got everything in place, they might be better placed to detect it. And this is part of what the report covers, is how to risk assess your business and how to understand how best to use the resources you've got. There are some really useful resources out there which can help you assess risk. So there's the Basel AML Index or the Financial Action Task Force list of high risk jurisdictions, both of which can help you understand the risk within your organisation. I think the main thing is that whatever size your organisation, whatever jurisdiction you're working in, you need to be thinking about this now and working out where your biggest risks are and making sure that they're mitigated against as far as possible.
And you mentioned the Basel AML Index. What does AML stand for?
AML is anti-money laundering. So that's another area of financial crime. And this is particularly pertinent to accountants working in public practice, where quite often they have to be regulated to make sure that they're up to date on anti-money laundering regulations.
And with the international impact of the global pandemic, of course, every link in that supply chain is even more vulnerable. But if we bring this back home, and I think you gave some examples earlier, how has the pandemic changed the kind of tactics that fraudsters are using to try and get through a business's defences?
The pandemic has really increased the desperation of criminals. They're having a hard time right now as well, and are also subject...
Did you say that it's made criminals more desperate?
Absolutely. So
that is so interesting. I'd never considered that. It also affects them the same way. They're also desperate to make more money.
Absolutely. So they're subject to the same restrictions on movement that we are. They're also stuck at home. Some of their usual channels of getting hold of money might have dried up. So we're seeing opportunism. In the UK, as I mentioned before, we've seen more phishing and spoofing, and taking advantage of the fact that there is increased government communication, that there are new new loans and support schemes out there. And we've also seen an increase in ransomware attacks, and a recent KPMG report suggests that ransomware attacks have increased during COVID, with specific examples being criminals tricking people into downloading malicious software, claiming that it's, for example, free video conferencing software. And then once that's downloaded onto your laptop, it takes control of your computer system, and it can freeze an entire organization's access to their computers until that ransom's been paid. And there are examples in the UK of universities, councils, and other organizations being hit by ransomware attacks during COVID-19. So I think it's just increasing the ingenuity of these criminals and trying out different ways of getting hold of money.
Just because we're saying that criminals are desperate too, we're not empathizing. We're just saying that we have to bear in mind that they are trying even harder to commit fraud on organizations and professionals. And that is something which we cannot afford to ignore at all. Just remind us, what types of roles does this report focus on? Is it just management accountants?
The focus of the report is really for finance professionals, management accountants in whatever business or organisation they're working in. So larger organisations will have compliance teams, in which case it might be that management accountants are a kind of secondary to that level of defence. But in smaller organisations, it might be the finance professional who ends up taking the lead. I do think it has a relevance to non-financial professionals, though, or non-accountants, because a lot of the skills that we talk about being really important aren't specific to management accountants. So it's about having a commitment to ethics, to doing the right thing. It's about having a mindset of skepticism, of approaching work with an inquiring mindset and questioning things when they don't seem right. So it certainly has a wider relevance.
Excellent. So definitely relevant to professionals in other contexts, not just management accountants. So give me a sense of who typically should be overseeing and delivering an organization's fraud responses. Will these only be the team members, the colleagues who have the word fraud in their job titles?
Where people have fraud in their job titles, absolutely, clearly that's going to be their role to take a lead on it. But I think it's really important to recognise that actually anyone within an organisation can be making a difference on these things. And quite often it's not the person with fraud in their job title, but it's the person who's spending their whole day in the accounts, who's knows the business, who understands when something has changed, who can actually have the biggest impact. So although you might have a fraud expert setting up these processes, if your organization has those resources, that doesn't mean that other people can kind of take a step back and put their hands up and say, it's not my responsibility. It's for everybody in an organization, and especially those people who are working with the financial data or sensitive data, to make sure that they're switched on to the risk of fraud and are constantly making sure that they're approaching things with that inquiring mindset and ensuring that they're aware of what's going on around them.
And then they'd work with other colleagues in other roles or perhaps other teams. How about the role of a compliance team?
Compliance teams are absolutely key to counter fraud measures, especially in large and complex organisations, and they're often the experts when it comes to regulations, risk assessments and governance. And there is a lot of regulation that comes around financial crime. So those compliance teams are absolutely key to making sure the organisation is in compliance with all of those various things. But they should be working with the people on the ground who are in the accounts every day, who are working with that sensitive data and who are most likely to spot things that are out of the ordinary. So absolutely not to minimise the role of the compliance team. They are completely key in this, but they should be working hand in hand with other professionals to make sure that they're spotting things as soon as they come up.
Right. I think it's time for us to talk about what the typical firm can do right now. What can they put in place quickly to get on top of this very important situation? We'll find all of that out in just a minute as we continue our conversation in advance of International Fraud Awareness Week, which begins next week, November 15th, all the way through to the 21st, 2020. You're listening to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast. It's brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. You can find out more about this podcast and about the rest of the work we do at gobeyonddisruption.com. The title of this podcast episode is Unlocking the Fraud Fighting Tools You Didn't Know You Have. Bryony, what are these tools, or more precisely, who are they?
They're the people who are working with the accounts every day, who can spot things that are out of the ordinary. So it's about looking beyond the job title. Look at the type of knowledge that a person's built up over time at an organisation. Sometimes it's the person that's been there for the longest who knows the most or will spot most quickly when something changes. But however junior you are or whatever position you're in, you have the ability to catch fraud. And remember that these types of attacks can hit anyone. Phishing, spoofing, ransomware attacks are most likely to target the people with access to the accounts or sensitive information. So anyone who's working with sensitive data within an organisation, it's really important that they know how to spot and report fraud, and they can be a really useful tool in spotting things before they go wrong.
Yeah, people are important. And we also know that people are the ones attempting frauds on businesses. So when we think about a firm trying to reduce costs, when we're rationalizing or trying to increase efficiencies, we know that cutting the wrong people from the team is a mistake. So we've talked about who those people would be, who we need to keep. But of course, there's other things that we could be looking at. What are some of the other fraud fighting tools a firm may already have, but perhaps don't know it yet?
You'll already have things in place which are protecting your organisation. So IT teams should have security controls in place, which are protecting against phishing and spoofing attempts. And I think one of the things that is quite often overlooked is the culture of an organisation. So if you've got a culture in your organisation where people are happy to speak up when something feels wrong, when they know that if they've spotted something out of the ordinary, that if they raise that, it will be investigated properly, that's a massively important tool in the fight against fraud. And that comes down to things like, do you have a code of ethics or an employee charter that encourages that mindset of doing the right thing? Do you have company values that everybody knows that include things like courage and speaking up and doing the right thing? I think it's those intangible factors that actually can make the biggest difference in this.
And you talked about a culture, and earlier you used the term security mindset. What exactly is that?
It's about being prepared, really. It's about making sure that people in your organization know that it's better for them to speak up when they see something unusual and hopefully prevent it than it is to stay quiet and let something happen. It's about having clear policies in place in the organization that encourage that. So, for example, requiring management approval for expenses above a certain amount, or requiring people to declare conflicts of interest. It's about having an action plan, a business continuity plan, and a fraud response plan that are all absolutely vital in ensuring that when something is detected, the business can get through it and key lessons are learned. It's really about being prepared in advance, making sure that your people know what's expected of them. They know what to do. They know how to escalate something if it happens, and then making sure that the organization has that security mindset and has those things in place before it happens.
But if it does happen, then that raises an ethics question. And I'm glad I'm talking to an ethics person, because this to me sounds like an ethical dilemma. If you spot something in time to stop it from happening, obviously that's good. But my question is, what do you do afterwards? What about a case where criminals did get through? I mean, ethically, what as an organization would you do? Would you inform everyone in the team and leave it at that? Or would you let a wider group of people, in fact, maybe the entire company or the organization know about it? Or do you put it out publicly as a press release? Do you let your investors or shareholders know? Or on the other hand, do you try to serve the interests of your shareholders and your team, perhaps by not speaking up, by not publicizing this? Because if you do, then perhaps that erodes the perceived value of the company. So, Bryony, if I ask you to put your ethics hat on, what are the options here? When does it go from internal to external, or should it?
As with all ethical dilemmas, there really isn't a clear answer to this one. In some cases, there will be a legal obligation to report it externally. So in the EU, for example, if there's a loss of personal data, then there's a duty to report it under the GDPR. In other cases, there won't be that clear obligation. It will be up to the organisation. I think the main thing is that lessons are learned when a fraud does occur, and that the same thing doesn't happen again. So that might mean that processes need to be changed, tighter controls are put in place, in which case using an example of a fraud that has happened as a case study might be appropriate, sharing it with colleagues so they can see what happened and how it could have been prevented. I think that's the most important thing. If you do decide to share it, ensuring that it's in a positive light in terms of how we responded and how we'll stop doing it again, rather than sharing it in the sense of this happened and it was terrible. It's about how do we make sure that we move forward from this in a positive way and we come out of it stronger.
That means even though the situation itself may not have been technically a success, it may have been a success for the fraudsters, not for your organization. The way you deal with it, the way you position yourself, the way you learn from it to do better next time, you have a successful response. So the success comes a bit later, which makes sense to me. But let's continue with that picture of success. Let's say a firm's got its security house in order. They're secure, their IT assets are locked down, shields are up. And now that they've got all of this nicely locked down, is it time to share the good practice? I mean, surely this would become a valuable service to offer. So how would a firm now start helping their clients and their partners to do the same?
Absolutely, it can be a valuable thing to do. So as we mentioned earlier, risk comes from upstream and downstream partners and suppliers. So working collaboratively can reduce risk for everybody. Sharing case studies, which can be anonymized if you need to protect confidentiality, can be helpful, or sharing useful resources. So our new report, for example, contains steps for building out a fraud response plan. And if that's something that would be helpful to your clients or partners, then absolutely sharing those sort of resources can be hugely useful, because a lesson learned in one organization might help prevent a similar thing from happening in another organization.
Yeah. Share the good stuff. And if you can turn it into a service, even better. Talking of what we do next, let's get ahead of the curve and look at the next disruption in this context. What did your report uncover about what's around the corner? What are businesses telling you that they're starting to notice as they work to protect themselves and their clients from fraudsters?
I think COVID is going to be the massive theme for the foreseeable future. It has changed the way that we work in such dramatic ways, and things don't look set to go back to how they were soon, if ever. So businesses need to be alert to this. How are the changed ways of working affecting defences? I think I've picked up that ransomware is something that all organisations need to be aware of and plan for. Do you have a plan in place for what would happen if you lost access to your computer systems for a few days or weeks? Planning in advance for that sort of thing might cost money, but in the long term, it will end up saving your organisation money and potentially saving your organisation, because organisations have had to fold because of ransomware. So this is something that I really think is massively important and topical at the moment.
Keep your eyes open for attempts to hit your business with ransomware. Right, Bryony, before we wrap up, time for some signposting. For anyone who'd like to find out more about the report or this topic in general, perhaps about your own work in particular, what are the resources that you'd recommend?
Definitely take a look at the new report. So it's called Keep Your Account Safe, Your Guide to Combating Financial Crime. And you'll find the link in the show notes for the episode. I'd specifically recommend looking at the section of the report on building out a fraud governance plan. And again, there'll be a link to that. If you're interested in CIMA's ethics work, more generally, take a look at the ethics pages of our website and also our writing for Financial Management magazine, where you can find things on emerging ethical topics, from ethical leadership during a crisis to ethics and technology, sustainable development goals, non-financial reporting, all of these areas that are just increasing in importance.
And before we go, I'm going to pretend to give you your very own Go Beyond Disruption podcast t-shirt. And on the front of that, you can print whatever you like, which we hope would be the most important takeaway from this conversation that you and I have just had. So, Bryony, what's that one message that you'd like to leave for accounting and finance professionals that will help them go beyond disruption? What is that t-shirt going to say?
I think I'd print on the t-shirt, preventing fraud saves money. And I mean that in the sense that it might cost you money now to put those controls in place, or it might feel like it's an easier way out to make cuts to compliance budgets. But actually, in the long term, putting in place those fraud controls could save your business a lot of money in the longer run.
Super. It's your t-shirt. That was Bryony Clear Hill, the Associate Manager for Ethics Awareness here at the CIMA Governance and Professional Standards Directorate. We've been talking about how to unlock the fraud-fighting tools that you didn't know you had. And that's it for this episode. If you'd like to see the links, the report, just follow the links in the show notes. And for more information, just click on this episode's info icon in the podcast app on your smartphone or your tablet, or just open the episode in your computer's web browser and you'll find everything right there. That is it from us for this week. And remember, next week, 15th November, the beginning of International Fraud Awareness Week. Find us wherever you get your podcasts or your music. Simply visit gobeyonddisruption.com. And for now, from the London office of AICPA and CIMA, I'm Kyle Hannon. Till next time, keep listening and keep safe. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-CIMA.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.